Hi, everyone. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane.
Welcome to the musical Innertube, the podcast born out of a mistake.
We once meant to introduce a soothing musical interlude, but we said soothing musical Innertube, and the name stuck.
On this podcast, we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives, jobs, hobbies, and passions.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
Our guest today again is Michael Wood, Professor Emeritus of English and Comparative Literature at Princeton University. His wide-ranging curiosity has led him to teach and write all over the world and in many languages about many literatures. This is our second straight episode starring Michael because he's been writing such interesting books. And today we discuss yet another one, his 2023 book, Marcel Proust. But before we get to that, Don, go ahead.
I feel like we should put a little subtitle on this. Last week on the musical Innertube.
Yes.
Previously on the musical Innertube. We talked about Hitchcock, and at the end of last week's talk, Michael, I kind of dismissed Frenzy. And I went back and rewatched it this week. And although I do still think it's Hitchcock desperately trying to be Hitchcock again, maybe over the top trying to be Hitchcock again, because it's very violent and it's very fast moving. But one thing that occurred to me, and it was especially after our talk about Shadow of a Doubt, the guy in Frenzy almost gets away with it again, even to the point of putting him in danger to get his pen back. There's a pen on one of his victims that she has in her hand, and he dumps her body and then realizes he doesn't have the pen and goes back to her body to get that pen. And he's in peril. And we actually kind of feel for him because he's in the back of a truck desperately trying to get this pen. He finally gets it. He gets out. He's relieved. He walks away. And he's not actually caught until the final frame of the film. So this is part of that suspense that we were talking about last week that just kind of glared at me when I rewatched Frenzy.
Don, I think that's a really great thought. I think you're right about the movie. He is trying a little bit too hard to be Alfred Hitchcock. I think that he feels that he's not been Alfred Hitchcock for a while, and it's time to do it. But that movement is I think a real attempt to do in detail the thing he's often doing at other times. That is to make us feel almost in our nerves that the way what could happen and what could not happen are almost identical.
Yes.
It's just a matter of a pin or of a moment that happiness, unhappiness, there's no boundary really between these two things, except there's what actually happens. He's inviting us to live in a kind of world where the theory of what might happen is actually far too close to the practice of what does happen.
Exactly.
I think that's what he likes. It's very scary, I think. It's
very, very scary. Yeah, I know the whole movie's scary. It's at a breakneck pace. One of the other things that I wanted to say before we got into this, John, is that I have in my entire career not been exposed to Proust. My entire exposure to Proust has been in the last week when John has force-fed me several Proust and your book, which I thumbed through. And the only thing I want to say is to kick it off is I'm one of those unwashed Proust people that you're talking to. So convince me. Number two, I remember one of my literature teachers in college, and one of the people raised their hands about halfway through and said, "How come you haven't assigned any Proust?" And she said, "I haven't assigned any Proust for the same reason I haven't assigned James Joyce, and that is you have to be in a certain frame of mind to read those things and to figure out what's going on. And I don't want you going there unless you voluntarily want to go there." So I said, okay, fine. Proust is unreachable. I'm not going there. And I continued my life until this very moment, Proustless. So gentlemen, convince me that Proust is something that I have been derelict in and needed desperately in my life.
Okay.
Well,
do you want to take it from there?
Sure, yeah. Well, let's talk about that because poor Marcel Proust has suffered the double curse of being universally famous, often called the greatest of all 20th century novelists, yet almost unknown. And one thing involved may be the sheer length of his life work. titled In Search of Lost Time, which weighs in at between 6 and 7 volumes, depending on which edition you're reading. So, to rescue him from being only a funny name in Monty Python's very funny Summarized Proust competition, let me give you a quick potted introduction to Marcel Proust. He was born in 1871 and died in 1922. He was a very accomplished essayist and occasional writer in turn-of-the-century Paris, moved among many of the best literary salons, did a long-time social column, and had literary acquaintances such as Anatole France and André Gide. He was also a very sick man, suffering from a vascular disease that would lead to his early death. Because of this illness, Proust was all but a recluse for much of his adulthood, writing in bed in a famous cork-lined bedroom. In the first decade of the 20th century, he was trying to write a novel, as well as a long philosophical treatise, as Michael documents in his new book titled Proust, when, in 1908 or 1909, something happened, as we hope Michael will talk about. Whatever did happen, by 1909, Proust was at work on his great masterwork, In Search of Lost Time. By the way, it's amazing to me that, sick as he was, because this is no joke what he had, this vascular disease, sick as he was, he writes a huge 7-volume novel like this, just to keep that in mind. On one hand, it's a huge tapestry about French social life. On the other, it's a penetrating investigation of intensely private individual lives. And above all, it concerns memory with its power to bring together long-distant experiences and allow us, in effect, to stand outside the movement of time and understand the arc of things. Proust self-published the first volume, Swann's Way, because he couldn't get anybody to publish it, in 1913. And he saw 3 other volumes published before he died at age 51. His brother Robert published the last 3 volumes. In 1919, the second volume, In the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower, won the prestigious Goncourt Prize, which I think Michael will agree with me is sort of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award all in one. And that was the thing that made Proust widely famous. Michael, would you want to add anything to that? I feel terrible about writing, such a sort of aerial view of a life like this.
I think that's great, John. I think it actually catches a great deal of sort of the mystery and what is really going on there. So I think the 2 things I would add is that he published the first of the, there were 6 or 7 volumes, as you say, depending on which edition you use. He published the first one in 1913. He published nothing at all between 1913 and 1919 when he published the second volume, right? So that the war, a whole world war and a whole change of French society intervened between the publication of Volume 1 and Volume 2. Initially, there were only supposed to be 2 volumes, and so he'd written the first and the last. So the novel itself is a kind of immense insertion into the middle of an already written book.
Wow!
So he got the beginning and he got the ending, and he had the middle, and he kept extending the middle.
And the world that he was writing about at one point was no longer there toward the end of it.
Yeah, it wasn't there anymore, and I think it's. I think of this sort of. This is very similar in this, I think, to Henry James, for example, and to Virginia Woolf, and to Faulkner, where the part of the art is to put more clauses into the sentence. Not we know where the main verb is, we know what the subject is, and we know what happens at the end, but there's nothing to stop you from filling out the sentences with subordinate clauses. That's what he does endlessly. But in a way, that mirrors the structure of his time and his writing life. If you like these kind of things, you can look at a photocopy of the last page of his manuscript. I wanted the Oxford to do that in the book, but they wouldn't do it. It was just too fancy. But the last page of the manuscript shows the last sentence of the book, right? And it says something like, it says, if I have time, I will make sure that I write a book about people who are situated in time. That's the main sentence. And so the word time appears at the very last word of the book, time, right? It's about a very simple clause. He just fills it out again and again with time. We stand on it like monsters on stilts. Time is this and this and this. So by the time you got to the edge, half of it's crossed out, half of it's written in between the lines. At the bottom of the page, it says end, fin, F-I-N. Except that the writing goes on over the top of the word fin. I've always loved that. To me, it's not just about Proust. It's about a lot of great writers are essentially writing unfinishable books. You can end them, but you can't finish them. You know?
I think his brother Robert probably was grumbling the whole time, going, that guy, oh my God, because Robert had to see the last 3 volumes through the press. And controversially, I might add, some people wonder how much is him and how, but I don't know.
Yeah,
but,
they do.
And
they've been sort of, since people have had access to all the papers, there have been some very good editions of this, sort of saying, but nobody finally knows what he would have done. But there's the more recent edition, the more thorough. Also, a lot of people complain about the currently standard editions, 4 volumes, 4 volumes on very thin paper and very tiny print. And a huge matter of this is actually what might have been there that wasn't. So if you got the 4 volumes, but actually there would only be 3 volumes if you didn't know all the notes of manuscripts, drafts, and stuff. So, and I think it's valuable, but a lot of people complain this is not the way to publish a great book because it turns it into a kind of scholarly enterprise.
Such an object is illegible by most definitions of legibility.
You can't really read it, and you don't want it. Yeah. So many people complain. I think it's useful, and it's up to date, and some great scholars have worked on it. But again, it's very off-putting if what you want is closeness to the book. I think.
What do you think happened to him? Because he was a pretty good writer in 1907. He was laboring at a novel that he sort of knew didn't have the guts to get over the finish line. I've read that one too, and obviously it's got its brilliant moments, which do get imported to In Search of Lost Time. He knew how to use old stuff.
Yeah.
And then he was writing this philosophical argument against Sainte-Beuve, and which also doesn't really get there either. And so he's like a lot of writers, they're very good, but they don't have their they don't have their vehicle. But then something happens and suddenly he does. Do you have any idea what the turning point was for this guy?
Well, I think that a lot of people talk about this moment, and I think none of us are really going to know what actually happened. But my take on this is sort of literary rather than psychological, let's say. And it would go with an idea. A broad idea would be this: that point number 1, the only openly aggressively modernist writers write in English. James Joyce, Virginia Woolf. Other writers like Proust and Thomas Mann don't know they're modernist and don't look like modernists. So the first thing that they are deeply into the same sort of story. There's a wonderful story about Thomas Mann reading a little book by Harry Levin about Joyce and realizing that he was a modernist. He didn't think he was. He thought James Joyce was the real modernist, and he was the old-fashioned bourgeois guy who wrote in the old 19th century way. Then he realized that actually, if you're retelling stories like the story of Dr. Faustus and Joseph and his brothers from the Bible, and you're doing it with endless irony,
yes,
you're as modern as it gets.
So interesting.
And so it's in that context that I think Proust, working with the very traditional idea that criticism and fiction are very different things, and you have to do one and not the other, and kept getting into a mess because one would invade the other. His book about Sainte-Beuve has got fictional stuff about him talking to his mother and other kinds of stuff and these kind of things. And his literary stuff has often got a lot of critical material about things. And I think that there are 2 things. The broad thing is that he understood he didn't have to do one or the other. He could do both. As he could write a novel that would fail every creative writing program instruction to show and not tell, right? And I have elsewhere in a thing about the essay novel, because I think there are ways of arguing that a lot of writers do that.
Sure.
Like Ishiguro, Julian Barnes, a lot of people, Angela Carter, they actually do write novels that are, in fact, a form of essay.
Yes.
What I take to be the more intimate thing in Proust, which I find very moving, is that he's writing this book about, he's trying to write this novel, and he's written a few chunks of it. They're not really very good. I mean, this is the important thing. They're not all that good, and he knows they're not all that good. So he says to himself, literally says to himself, I'm quitting here. I'm going to write a book of criticism because I cannot write a novel. I'm not up to it. I can't do it, but I can probably write a decent work of criticism, and that's better than doing nothing. So I'll do this. As he starts writing a work of criticism, I don't think he consciously thinks of conflating criticism and fiction. But I think something more intimate happens. In the work of criticism, he writes a lot about how he's failed to write a novel and what it means to fail to write a novel. He writes so beautifully about failure that actually it's better than anything he's done. And at some point, I think he understands that you can go where it takes you if the writing is good. So he starts saying things. There's things like in the work of criticism, he says things like a great book is like a song you can't remember.
Right. Yes.
And then you try to remember the song, and then you can't remember it. And then he says, but this song you can't remember will pursue you all your life.
The ultimate earworm.
And when that's so good writing. If you could do that, you could do anything. You know?
We should say that there are people in this book, and that it is a largely autobiographical book. The last book takes us to Venice, where he went with his mother. One of the very few times Proust was ever away from France.
Yeah.
And all the names have been changed. Everybody thinks they know who the people really were.
Yeah.
All these things are interesting because it's all been traced so that we know who the big society figures are. There is a party that takes 360 pages in my book.
Yes,
and you love the party. You don't want it to go away. And you keep reading it and keep reading it. And at a certain point, you realize, wow, I have read a book-length party.
Yes, right.
And that's like the 52-page sentence by Faulkner.
Yes.
You wonder whether either writer realized what they were doing. Whether it's just that's what happened in the midst of it. But there are people who do real things. You could say that the main protagonist is not the narrator, Marcel, but perhaps Monsieur Swann, who has a love affair with Odette, or at least some kind of passionate affair for a woman named Odette. I don't want to give everything away, but it's fairly intense. And I think that Marcel, in telling us about them, falls in love with both of them. If he wasn't in love before, the act of telling the story makes him attached to them. World War I is in there. I was telling Don about a bombing raid made by Zeppelins in World War I in Paris, which is part of it. There's a stay at a sanatorium, which does prefigure Magic Mountain a little bit. There's a wonderful, the second volume, Young Girls in Flower. The whole family, he's still a young man at this point, and the whole family takes a holiday out to a place called Baalbek, but I think we know this is the Normandy area, and they've gone out to a beach town, and this is where he kind of becomes attached to a young woman named Albertine, whom he later will imprison in his house, but that's years later. So I don't want people to think that this is just philosophy, but what I want to say is what you've just said, Michael, is that the book is amazing in that the persons that are in the book and what they do are fascinating, but so is what's by the by. So are the things that he says by the way, he has fascinating things to say about newspapers, for example, which he dearly loved. It was his only lifeline to the outside world. He loved his newspaper with his cup of milk in the morning, he says. And one that sticks in my mind is he says, no human being we've ever met is a straight line. And and I hope that's well translated.
Yeah.
You know this better than I do. So I think it's a book that's amazing, not only in what it's about and what it contains in terms of story and character, but also in what it says in the meantime.
Yeah, I think that's great, John. I think the other thing that's interesting is, and goes both ways in this story, is that the whole thing is in a way historical. It belongs to a certain moment in time. It's intense with French history, a certain period of French history, particularly in the run up to World War I and during, all the way through World War I. But the interesting thing, it's also more. A lot of people take it to be a direct transcription. So Swan would be X, some real guy. This is partly true. There is a real guy there, except that there's a real guy, and then there are 4 more real guys. So the actual composition, there's a very good book by Malcolm Bowie called Proust Among the Stars, where he talks about we have to pay attention to the labor that went into this. He didn't just say, for example, Balbec, that place in Normandy. It's not in Normandy, it's in Brittany.
Right, I'm sorry, I read. Yeah,
that is in the book. It's in Brittany, but it's a place in Normandy that he's moved to Brittany for purpose of having more sea and better storms and stuff. So he's actually shifted. It is a place, it's all copied from a hotel. You can go and visit the hotel. It's 100 miles or so to the east of to the west in the novel, and all of it's like that. And my favorite bit of this, the village where the boy spends his childhood and has his first troubles with his mother not coming to kiss him goodnight, and then the whole family does all this stuff, is a place called Combray in the novel, and it's somewhere near Chartres, southwest of Paris. In the last novel, he needs the place to be occupied by the Germans, so he moves there. So it's not southwest. It's not southwest of Paris. It's on the way to Belgium, right? And that seems to be, I always think of that as kind of wonderful contrast with Joyce, for example. And saying in Ulysses, all the historical details have to be correct. We need to know you got the right day for a horse race, and you got to know that the right horse won.
Yes,
that's its authenticity method. And the street you can go down Eccles Street, and you can find number 7 Eccles Street where an imaginary person lived. That's a very brilliant sort of fictional. But Proust is the opposite. The world itself is historical, but you can do what you like with it.
It's so nice.
So it's a very interesting move, because Joyce's work wouldn't work if he got things like that wrong. Whereas Proust, I think Proust, and also the argument's different. Joyce is saying the world is real, and so are novels. But Proust is saying the world is imaginary, and so are novels.
So novels.
It's a little too crude, but it's something like that. There's a kind of active imagination.
We'll return to our podcast in just a moment, but first, here's a soothing musical interlude.
Michael Wood is Professor Emeritus of English and Comparative Literature at Princeton University.
Born in the city of Lincoln, England, Michael received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in modern and medieval languages from Cambridge University.
He has written widely and in many languages about everyone from Franz Kafka to William Butler Yeats and Vladimir Nabokov. Among his many honors are a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, and a fellowship at the British Academy.
For more about Michael Wood, check out his Princeton University webpage at english.princeton.edu/people/Michael-Wood.
And now, we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
So I don't mean to put Don on the spot here, but Don, I gave you the first 50 pages and said, look this over. What were your impressions of Marcel's relationship with his mom and that whole scene where she doesn't kiss him goodnight and suddenly there's this big rift in the fabric of existence? What did you make of that?
Well, rather than being literal about it, I'm going to step back for a while because in listening to you guys talk and in sort of reading around the edges, I read some things online about Proust and about his effect on literature and his effect on the people that lived with him, his brothers and so on. And I got the idea, the big thing, and John, you pointed this out when you gave me the thing, the big thing in the first book, besides Swan coming in and not getting kissed goodnight by his mother, which is right up front in the book, is also that Madeline piece.
Yes.
And that's a point where he takes a cookie and dips it into his tea and eats it. And the thing of eating it brings back his memory of when he did that as a child. And that, I think, maybe is why it's looked upon as a psychological novel, because it may be a sweeping autobiography of every place he's been and every person he's met, but it's also him reflecting on what that did to him and what he thinks that did to the world. And Mike, in the end of your book, you talk about the last part of the novel where he is sitting in a lobby, I guess, or in a study, waiting for chamber music to end in the next room. When it ends, he goes in, thinks he's in a costume party because everybody looks different, but in reality, they've just aged. And he hasn't, and he can't recognize these people. And then he does recognize them as older, and he thinks he's younger. So again, I can see where people would get all mixed up with Proust as not being a novelist, but being somebody who talks about psychology. I also don't know why anybody hasn't made a time travel movie out of this.
Yes.
You know,
absolutely.
Some good science fiction time travel movie out of this.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point. I think the interesting thing about the Madeleine experience, he has that experience, and he has in that waiting for the music to end, he has 3 more experiences. And this is the sort of is rather like Joyce. He says at one point, you know, the whole book is based on these sort of experiences. The philosophical, psychological bit behind the experience is that conscious intention and will get you nowhere. The only thing that will save your life is accident. And that accident has to be a matter of senses. You have to smell it or feel it or taste it. And that will bring back everything you ever lost. But you can't make it happen. If you're trying to make it happen, you'll fake it. But if you just hang on and you're lucky, it will happen. It's a kind of fairy tale. The question of whether Proust scholars argue endlessly about whether Proust himself believed in this fairy tale and felt it was a true story of his own life, or whether he just liked it and wanted a bit more like Hitchcock, wanted to say, this is what might happen to you if you're lucky.
Right.
Rather than, this is what's going to happen to you. But it is a very interesting point about the notion of sensation there coming in. And the other thing I think we need to add to this is he's often very funny.
Oh yes,
I think in a kind of knockabout way. So if you on the one hand you put it feels more like a work by Freud, let's say, or some modern psychologist than a proper novelist. On the other hand, if at the same time it feels like a Chaplin or Buster Keaton movie, people are always falling over things and stumbling over bits of pavement and sort of crashing into things and doing psychological things of that kind, then you do begin to get a sense of how weird this would be and how actually it depends on your mood. This could be very boring. I can imagine this is a book of many people couldn't, read too many. But the first readers are people like André Gide, who turned down the volume of Swann before it was published, said, who the hell cares about a guy just not being able to sleep?
Right. Yes, that's really what the first chapter is.
This guy spent 30 pages about saying he can't go to sleep. Who cares? Yeah. And that is sort of interesting. You have to take it less seriously rather than more seriously to get into it.
I think if you try to take the Albertine novel seriously, you have to take it as a picture of something else, I think.
Yes. I think that's absolutely right.
Because, first of all, I think it's funny in its absurdity.
Yeah.
And so I personally still don't know how to take it, which will knock on to my next question in a minute, because what we have is a grown woman who, without that much complaint, puts up with being imprisoned by a guy. And so that already is puzzling, but their relationship is puzzling too, as we're going to, so this does knock on to my next question, which is, so when I finish these books, I felt some relief.
Yes.
But mostly what I felt was gratitude.
Yeah.
There's very few books that have made me feel grateful that I have them with me now. And I felt that way for this book. But I will say this one thing, that there is almost nothing in it that I would recognize personally as love.
No.
I think what takes love's place is an anguished attempt to conserve the sexual resource, to guard it.
Yeah.
Basically, jealousy.
Yeah, absolutely.
A very anxious and angst-ridden jealousy, first with Swan, and later with the narrator and Albertine.
Albertine, yeah.
I'd love you to talk more about that, because we don't really, even though I think he feels he's got crushes on all the society women, Madame Verdurand, and he when he goes to these parties, he can get a crush up pretty well,
Yeah, sure.
But
sure.
What we call love, I don't find it,
Oh.
and I think it's replaced by this kind of jealousy. Now, it may be related to the fact that this is a novel that's sort of a beard for a homosexual
Also
tragedy, which is happening. The idea that you can't have what you want, and that is definitely there and definitely vibrant. But I wonder if there's other knock-ons that you see, that this is a novel really without love as we understand it.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, I think maybe the mother loves her child. There might be parental love. I think she probably comes clean in this thing. She really does love her child. But even she has the faults of a sort of certain kind of middle-class European family, which is they don't think the kid should be who he wants to be. They think the kid should be who they want him to be. So even she, it was sort of a loving mother, she's still a sort of tyrant, and he's trying to break that out of that.
Yeah, right. And before he writes this novel, he writes something in which she's not so nice in those earlier
also,
writings.
It is literally the truth that he could not write the novel until she was dead. She had to die so he could write it. I mean, talking about the literal Marcel Proust now. He wouldn't have written it if she was alive. So she wouldn't have. She would a lot of things she wouldn't have approved of, and all that stuff. There is a theory that she didn't know he was gay. I don't believe that myself. She was a smart person. I think she figured out. I think he may at times have believed she didn't know. And I'm talking about the real Marcel Proust now, not the guy in the novel. He may have thought he'd kept his homosexuality secret from his mother, and because he would upset her so much. He doesn't understand how intelligent she is, and she's also not going to let on she knows, because she doesn't want to talk about it. Right? But I think the comedy and the kind of bleakness, if you like, of the human situation do go together, because some things nothing you can do with them except laugh at them, or except find their comic version, because there's no good sentimental version. A lot of people don't feel this about Proust. They feel that there's something, exactly what you're saying, John, is really important. I think it's absolutely right. There is no such thing as love between the sexes or across the sexes or anything. And Proust narrator is quite explicit about this. He uses the word anguish, or he uses the French word angoisse, which can mean anguish, it can mean anxiety, it can mean angst, and it can just mean fear. But he uses it all the time, and it's anxiety or anguish or whatever it is exactly what you say, John. That is, it's a form of selfishness. It's not to do with anybody else other than yourself, and it's a form of desire for possession of that which you cannot possess.
You can't make them stay. You can't make them not change. You can't
make them. Proust's idea, and I think he's a kind of. I don't know how he really felt. I think he was both. It was true about himself. This kind of thing. I think he's probably telling the truth here. But he was also kind of expert in a kind of pathology where, in fact, everything I think is really to do with myself and whether I'm in control or not. And then I think, at a certain point, you just pause for a second and think, well, wait a minute, this is sort of kind of weird psychological. But what if the whole society was like that? What if French society was largely like that? That's why they lost the war. That was why they didn't understand a whole lot of things. Here's a little historical riddle you could take out of Proust. Why would perhaps a majority of French people rather be defeated by the Germans than supported by the British? Is that possible within a country?
Well, it could explain why nobody likes the French.
Oh,
a lot of them don't want to be liked.
And they've had a lot of practice. They lost the Franco-Prussian War, and then they lost the First World War. It's they're trying to practice makes perfect, a more perfect defeat. It's
they're lovers, not fighters, right?
Yeah.
I think any Frenchman would tell you that.
Yeah. And Proust was born in 1871, born during the Commune and just after after they just lost a war.
Yes, a terrible defeat.
He was born into that world.
It seems too that we've talked about Swann and Odette, and still very moving, and everyone should. Sometimes the Swann story is published by itself, and you can find that.
Yeah,
and
it's a great story.
Yeah, it really is. And I don't know that a tragic affair like that has ever been. And what I mean by tragic is it can't be what the angsty one wants it to be. And that's what's tragic about Charlot is he never gets what he wants to get, and he goes to great lengths. He grooms the narrator for a while and excoriates him when he feels the narrator has not been nice enough to him lately.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the worst of all possible things happens to him, and he runs afoul of someone who basically tells everybody what he is, which is the terrible horror behind a lot of the discussion here, I suppose. But no one can, he keeps saying, our and this goes right to your point, Michael, that our judgments about people seem to us to be fixed and always consistent. When, if you laid them out in a row, nothing could be more like water.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and I think the other thing is quite interesting. This where the novel and the philosophical thing go together very nicely, and this would also be a bit like Hitchcock, is that if you live in a society which not only like the French, they're great lovers and they have a great culture of this sort of stuff, but you live in a world that probably rates logic and reason higher than any other culture, and certainly higher than they should do. And you yourself are trained in this language. It's the language you speak. It's the assumptions you have. It's the mythology. You grew up with everybody. You're a member of that nation, but you keep feeling it's wrong. And that's where the jokes often come in, where you make jokes and to show that it's wrong. But then sometimes you have to argue with it, or you have long demonstrations of how. Then this is why I think he's so hostile to what he calls the intelligence. It's got to be. He believes in the unconscious. He believes in accident.
Yes.
And he believes in being grateful for accidents, and you can have lucky accidents. And so it's not a doom. It's not fatalistic. It's not doomed. You're not bound to be unhappy, but you cannot make yourself happy. You can only be happy if you're lucky and you recognize your luck. That's it.
Let me ask one other question, and it's about the title of the book. The book, when it was first introduced to me, was called Remembrances of Things Past. Mm-hmm. And that has been the title for years. But now the title has been changed to In Search of Lost Time.
Yeah.
And I think roughly they're the same translation of the French title that Proust put on it. But it seems like a different interpretation. Like Remembrances of Things Past is, I'm looking back on my life. But In Search of Lost Time kind of tells me that there's something else going on there. Yeah. What do you guys think about that?
That's a really good point. I think the Remembrance of Lost Time actually was the early one, but it's a quotation from Shakespeare, not even Proust. It comes from a Shakespeare sonnet, right? And it's actually, if we want to be pedantic about it, it's actually wrong. The book is about you cannot remember. You can only have these mental invasions of memory.
Right.
Memory can talk to you, but you can't remember.
It can return if it wants to, but not when it's called.
So the idea of recalling is not there. So when he talks about involuntary memory, but he's not only just talking about, there is a thing called involuntary, he's saying that's the only kind of memory that counts. It's a very sort of polemical claim that real remembering is a waste of time, because you only remember what your conscious mind will tell you. Unconscious remembering will bring you back. This experience, the Madeleine experience, I think is quite common in ordinary life, and many people have something like this. I spent a lot of World War II with an aunt and uncle in a town called Newark, and there was a time when if I turned on the faucet in the bathroom, the water ran. I would be in their house.
Yes,
I could smell the place.
Oh yeah,
and I could, and then And after a while, it wouldn't happen anymore. Turn the table, it wouldn't work. Right? But it was exactly. In other words, when Proust talks about the Madeleine and tripping on a paving stone and having this sort of memory, it's not an exotic or strange event. I think he's appealing to something that many people would have had. They won't have built a whole theory of time and memory on it. But I think it's a very interesting idea. That notion that these intuitive, unintended moments, they're the real thing. And that whole structure, in France, it would be about reason and logic. In Anglo-American, it would be common sense, say.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of interesting picture that common sense lies to you a lot. and crazy, unintentional events like dreams and things tell you stuff.
Yes, I like the second title. For all these reasons, Michael, I like the second title more. I think it gets closer, that it's about a search for a time that went before. And the search is almost, he says at one point that memory does not in itself have a philosophical significance. It attaches
it doesn't.
to things and people and places and circumstance. And when it comes back, it often brings all those back with it. And it's up to us to feel the connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we've all had, it's like what people talk about with Joyce, the moment that enlightens, right? With even with Araby, it can be an enlightenment in the short story Araby when a person realizes, oh, actually, I'm a vain person. I'm wasting my time. But there are other, there are other illuminations of that sort, and he thinks that those Proust certainly thinks that those can change things for us or illuminate things for us.
Yeah, they're exactly what Joyce calls an epiphany, that you have a sort of a moment of but it's not an intellectual discovery, it's not logical, it's not rational. And I think even, the In Search Of is literally correct. But when you've read a bit, you realize actually it's not entirely clear from the title that search is vain. You can't look for it. You can find it, but you can't look for it. So there is a kind of irony about the whole project.
It'll find you if you're lucky.
It can find you if you're lucky, but we're all in search of lost time. But actually, the reason we're not finding it is because you can't find it. It can find you. And I think there is something. It's also the fact that there's a kind of pun in the French word. The French word "perdu" means lost and wasted. So you see, it could mean, you could translate as in search of the time I lost, or in search of the time I blew. Scattered. So normally if someone had said, to perdre son temps is to waste time. It's not to just spend it or lose it. To perdre son temps would only means to waste it. Temps perdu could mean time that's gone, but it's more likely to be wasted.
Let me ask, to round out this just wonderful discussion we're having, and Don's question certainly made me think of this. What is it like to read Proust in French? Because the debate goes on about translations versus translations, and you write so beautifully about how, as a translator, you're always in a fix because you are doomed not to get it right. Yeah. In fact, that's what translation is.
Exactly.
Is being doomed never to get it right. Yeah. But seriously, you've had the experience of reading Proust in volume in French. What is that experience like?
It's smoother to read in French, and there's say social difference in the kind of historical fact that most people speak correct French, including John, you and I were talking about one of the translations translates all the working class people drop their H's and drop their G's. So
hello, how are you?
Breaks your bleeding on, doesn't it? That sort of stuff. And there's nothing like that in French, so you don't get those kind of. But I think the translations do. I think I would rate Proust as among the relatively translatable writers, because I think I think, say more than Thomas Mann, for example. Thomas Mann, I think, is very hard to translate because everything is ironic and you can't tell. Yeah, it's like, imagine an English person who never says, I mean, we all know people like, so they never say what they mean and they always say something sarky.
Yeah.
You don't know what they think. Thomas Mann's like that all the time. So there's no, you can translate literally what it says, but you can't get that effect. But Proust not like that. Proust is very open and he uses a lot of metaphors. And metaphors are easy to translate also, generally. So logical propositions and metaphors are relatively easy to translate. Sometimes they're hard, but as writings go, it's easier to translate than a lot of people, I think. But for that reason, and reading is I mean, just if I may, just reminiscence. This goes to Don's question too. I had a double first experience of Proust. That is, I was studying French at a university, and I was supposed to read. I knew I had to read the book for the exam, but I was looking forward to it in a way. Except I thought I had all these prejudices about it. It's a great book and it's posh and it's going to be difficult. So I'll put it off till next week. Maybe later I'll get ready to get around to this stuff. And then I went to stay with my roommate in London, and his dad was reading Proust. His dad was an insurance man. And he was getting the translation, the old translation, out of the public. In those days, but you didn't buy books. You got them from the public library. You kept them for 2 weeks. Then you took them back. And he was taking out one volume at a time of Proust, and then coming back and read them. And he was ecstatic about this book. And I thought, here's the guy he's not literary at all. He just likes to read books. He thinks his book is really great. And I'm thinking it's probably going to be unbearable, but I'll get on with it. And then because when I did read it, I was prepared for it to be boring and highbrow and serious, and I would be respectful and all this stuff. But I kept laughing. I kept pausing till, and like the one every time I just mentioned, there's a wonderful moment when Madame Verduin, the great society hostess, when we first meet her, she can't laugh when her guests make jokes. And so she has to look as if she's falling around with laughter, but without actually laughing. So she covers up her mouth and she does various things. And then we learn a little bit later, this is because at one time she overdid laughing at one of her guest jokes and broke her jaw. It had to be fake. And then the narrator says, this is because she was so much in the habit of taking figurative things literally. Like I broke my ribs laughing. I guess I thought a writer could do that. I'm with him.
Yes.
It's a terrible joke. But it's like Groucho Marx, but I thought this was in the same class. Yeah.
So I just want to say this has been the best 50 minutes on Proust I've ever had, and we are so glad that you have spent a couple of episodes with us, Michael. And
it's been great fun.
I promise you, I'll wait for a little while before I ask you back, because you've got a book on Du Fu, the Chinese poet, the Tang poet, which we'd love to talk about, but we've learned so much about France and about writing and about just thinking about what we read today. So thank you. And thanks to Don for putting up with me.
Well, thank you both. This is a wonderful conversation. You don't have good conversation if you don't have a good partner.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Hey, let us know how we're doing. Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Do you know someone with a great story to tell? Let us know. Send us an email or log in to our website, musicalinnertube.com, and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast. They're all there, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
And as always, our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.